When I was a child, I grew up in a home where my parents found it really important to take me to Sunday school. So, Sunday school is this Sunday morning church education that we would go to before we went to worship. Adults would gather all the kids and put us into a big room, and we'd have to learn some songs about Jesus. And I remember that they had this little church piggy bank, like a little church bank. And if it was your birthday, you got to go up front and put the number of pennies as you were years old right into that bank, and that was considered our offering. So like if you were 6, you could put 6 pennies into the bank. And after you sang and did your offering, then you would go find your teacher, and your teacher would take you into a corner to learn the stories of the Bible. Stories like Noah's Ark and Jonah and the whale, or Abraham and Isaac. And when I was a kid, they would use this crazy new technology to illustrate this. That's right, kids, there was no videos for me. I didn't get a daily dose. Instead, I got, dun dun dun, flannel graph. Yeah. This week, we are wondering, what is the Bible? And we're using as a guideline for our series a book by author and speaker Rob Bell called the same thing, What is the Bible? But before we get into what is the Bible tonight, I'd like to invite you to, if you're watching on Facebook, I'd like to invite you to go ahead and like this post as well as share it onto your personal page. And if you're somebody who's joining us on YouTube, if you go ahead and click the bell and hit subscribe, and if you're joining us on cable access, would you just tell a friend and invite them to join in our series tomorrow? If you missed yesterday's message, you can go back on YouTube and catch them all right there. So as a kid, I really liked Sunday school. I was really entertained by this flannel graph, but as I grew older, I found myself with some pretty big questions about the stories that I would hear about on Sunday morning. Stories like Noah's Ark. You see, Noah's Ark is this story where there were some people, and the people of the whole world were really, really bad. And so God decides to flood the whole earth. But before God does this, he sends this guy Noah, and he tells him to build this giant ark, this really big boat, and then to put his family on there, and then 2 of every kind of animal. And then the story goes, it rained and the whole world flooded for about 40 days. And after that, God saved Noah and all the animals. And then he put up a rainbow in order to promise that he would never flood the world again. When you're a kid, it seems like any other sort of children's book that you are on a journey with. But then when you get a little bit older, the questions start rising about this story that we learned in Sunday school. Questions like, why were the people so bad, and what did they do? And if God could flood the earth, why didn't God just fix the people instead of killing them all? What happened to the dinosaurs or the unicorns? Did they just not make the ark on time? Or how did one family go back to populating the whole world? And how was the boat big enough for all of the animals? And where did they put the food for the animals? And then as you're a teenager and you start learning about the world differently, and you start thinking about geological time and rainbows being a collection of reflection and refraction of light and water, and that they're not just a half bow circle, but a full circle. This story in the Bible, it starts to look like something to argue against rather than something to accept. In my time serving on a college campus, I saw a lot of this. Students were taught the stories of the Bible just one way, but then as they learned more, it just didn't seem to hold up to the questions that flooded in for them. You see, what if it was never meant to be a literal story? What if instead it was more nuanced, more interesting, more dramatic even? What if instead there is more to this story than some animals and a rainbow? You see, Noah's Ark, it wasn't the only flood story that existed in the world at that time. Many, many cultures have flood stories. Sumerians told flood stories. Babylonians told flood stories. African cultures told flood stories. And in all of these stories, it talks about God enacting his wrath upon people, God being angry with people. Because you see, in many cultures at that time, people felt like they needed to please God in order for the weather to work in their favor. If they were good, then the weather would be good. But if they were bad, then the weather would be bad. We think this often in life. We think that what happens, it must be like a flood. We think that what we do might have a direct response into what we have done. And in some ways, this kind of thinking makes us think that we have some level of control over the world and over what happens to us. But you see, the thing about Noah's Ark, though, is that this story in the Bible, it's actually really progressive if you compare it to the other stories of floods. It's actually really, really enlightened. It gave a different perspective for people that were telling these stories at the time. It's in this story in the Bible that we're introduced to this mind-blowing concept for the ancient world. That this God does not want to just wipe humanity out. Instead, God does something different with this rainbow. Instead, God wants to have a relationship with humanity. This story of Noah and the flood was countercultural. It was different than what everybody had expected. And this is exactly the point of it. Not exactly how it was written, but God wants this relationship with humanity. God wants this covenant. God wants this promise. Author Rob Bell puts it this way. He says, if we reject all inexplicable elements of all stories that we have made up in our minds ahead of time, and that we simply think that such things are not possible, we run the risk of shrinking down the world to what we can comprehend. You see, God does this over and over with stories of the Bible. God offers a different perspective, a different narrative. If we spend all of our time reading the Bible at a stilted, literal form, then we miss what the Bible is really all about. Like how the story of Jonah and the big fish is really about God's grace and mercy for your enemy. Or the story of God asking Abraham to sacrifice his son Isaac really being about how God wanted to be able to be trusted by humans. I wonder, though, if this journey through the Bible, if this journey in discovering all the layers and all the depths and all the angles and sophistication at all, I wonder if this is what makes the Bible alive. A living book that continues to challenge us and continues to push us and continues to inspire us today. So here's my question for you tonight. What story in the Bible have you heard when you were a kid that you struggled with believing? Maybe explore that story farther. Find out what was behind that story and why the writer chose to write it, and why the editors of the Bible chose to include it in those 66 books. And what does that story have to say about you and about what it means to be human? And what does that story have to say about God? Join us again tomorrow night as we continue our series on what is the Bible.
In my wrestling, and in my doubts, in my failures, you won't walk out. Your great love will lead me through. You are the peace in my troubled sea. Whoa, you are the peace in my troubled sea. In the silence, you won't let go. In the questions, your truth will hold. Your great love will lead me through. You are the peace in my troubled sea. Whoa, you are the peace in my troubled sea. My lighthouse, shining in the darkness, I will follow you. Oh, my lighthouse, I will trust your promise. You will carry me safe. Oh,